Talkin TV heads? Dom the Movie Nerd is back. I'm back doing top 10 lists, but I'm doing them in a little bit of a different format now, a little bit less formal, a little bit more loose, a little bit more free form, bringing myself back on camera. In order to kick it off, I'm going to be redoing another top 10 list that I did several years ago now from the old Movie Nerd Reviews days, which is my top 10 favorite superhero movies. Superhero cinema have obviously become the dominant form of cinema in today's day and age. And if you guys actually watched my old video, which, God, what would you have? That video is terrible. And so I'm going to go down the rabbit hole of my top 10 list, see which ones have changed, see which ones are different, kind of remind myself what it is that we all love about this format, about this storytelling medium. Superheroes obviously mean a lot to a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons, and right now I'm going to break down why they are special and important to me. So here they are, Movie Nerd Reviews officially revamped top 10 favorite superhero movies. Kicking it off with Zack Snyder's Watchmen. This is a movie that I've watched several times, and I really, really enjoy it. It's one of those movies that just keeps getting better every single time I watch it. Zack Snyder's adaptation of Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' 1986 graphic novel, which follows a team of costume superheroes in an era in which being a said costume superhero has become outlawed. They team back together in order to try and find out what happened to one of their own when one of their own is murdered. It's a comic book that was vastly ahead of its time when it originally came out, and the movie received a decent amount of mixed criticism, usually a lot of the similar criticism that you find towards Zack Snyder stuff. But I think the reason why I keep coming back to this movie is because, like all of his other movies, Zack Snyder does visuals unlike anybody else in Hollywood. Like, the visual look of this movie, it's not even just the CG, it's the way that he actually makes his movies look. It really felt like I was watching a comic book brought to life. I still think a majority of the casting holds up, but what constantly fascinates me the most about this movie is how Zack Snyder actually does take the comic book and actually build it into something bigger, which is, I think, something that's been a little bit lost over time. The comic book, which was more so like a critique of superheroes and what it is that we love about them, and the movie kind of took that and built it into something bigger, which is it was more kind of encompassing of pop culture rather than just superheroes specifically. It's really fascinating, and it's one of the things that constantly sets us apart from a lot of the other superhero movies that I watch now. My next entry is the first Iron Man, a typical choice, a traditional choice, a stereotypical choice, whatever you want to call it. It's still great. There's a reason why this movie still holds up, aside from the obvious it kicked off the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe. But aside from that, this movie just still really holds up just as a really well-made movie, which is ironic considering the fact that Marvel movies are now so criticized for all looking the same, all feeling like they're all factory made on an assembly line. There doesn't feel like there's any real artistic intent behind them now. And it's still so crazy to me thinking back 14 years now to watching that first Iron Man movie in theaters and just how different and refreshing it felt. Like, there's a reason why 2008 is regarded as like the birth of superhero cinema. It's not just because it started these movies that have had these long-lasting trajectories since then. It's because they actually made superhero movies like really, really well, because they were building off of a decade where they were actually trying to make superheroes movies, you know, look like movies and not like overblown toy commercials. And obviously the underdog story behind this movie is kind of also what makes the underdog story of this movie so compelling to begin with, where you have them bringing in Robert Downey Jr. after a couple years of some really bad drug use, compounded with Marvel, a studio that had to file bankruptcy and sell off the rights to almost all of its big profitable characters. You get Jon Favreau directing off of Elf and Zathura. The studio wants to do it with Tom Cruise, obviously, but they can't get him because he wants to have his face exposed the entire time. And you bring in Downey Jr. to portray a billionaire who is, for the most part, been detached from a lot of the damage that his money has caused. And you force him to actually view that damage up close and personal, and it forces him to kind of reconsider his action. It's a superhero movie that actually forces its superhero to consider the consequences of their actions, something that Marvel has very heavily drifted away from in the years since. And just that struggle that it presents and that commitment to that struggle still, to me, is what allows this movie to hold up, even past a lot of some of its other flaws. Don't get me wrong, this movie does have some flaws. The third act, it's not the best, but I mean, it's the movie that gave us Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, which still to this day is regarded as one of the best superhero castings just in general. My next entry is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and this is a movie that In hindsight, it's kind of surprising that I didn't love it immediately. It's actually kind of surprising. I love this movie now, obviously, but I wasn't like in love with it like the minute I walked out of the theater. It's one of those movies that surprisingly took me a while to really fall in love with. And I think the reason why that is because Spider-Man has really never been one of my favorite superheroes. I know a lot of people love Spider-Man and they go gaga about him. They relate to him so much. And for some reason, it just kind of never related to me. Probably because I've never had a family member that's been murdered in front of me. I guess it's the idea that the fact that Spider-Man's struggle is just so unbelievably familiar to the point where it's like I didn't even really want to watch another live action Spider-Man solo movie, I should say. It's one of a few reasons why I'm not the biggest fan of the Tom Holland live action Spider-Man movies. I was definitely a lot happier that they were going to focus on Miles Morales and that this wasn't going to be another Peter Parker story. But of course I should have known better, and of course I'm eating my words in hindsight because Phil Lord and Chris Miller were behind this movie, and I mean just the animation alone is enough to watch this movie. But it's just the fact that this movie does what so many other movies that I watched in the 2010s did so well, which is they take those tried and true stories and just find a way to make it feel so new and refreshing. On top of the fact that in addition to this being another Spider-Man origin story, this was also kind of our low-key introduction to the multiverse, as this movie also throws in 6 other Spider-Man on top of all the litany of Spider-Man villains that you get in this movie. But it's so visually pleasing. It's never over-nauseating. The heart, the message, all the stuff that you love about your Spider-Man stories, it's all there. The voice cast, of course, is terrific because Lord and Miller know how to get great performances out of their actors. And this movie goes to some pretty dark places, even for like typical kiddie animated fare. And of course, the thing that the internet and everyone else has pointed out, the fact that Lord Miller actually incorporated the rendering process, the actual animation process in and of itself in order to tell the story with that infamous frame of Miles swinging alongside Peter B. Parker when they're escaping from the compound, and he's swinging past him and he's swinging at a lower frame rate than Peter Parker in order to demonstrate that he is less experienced as being Spider-Man. I mean, when you pull off visual storytelling to that level alone and you're that detail oriented, I mean, that alone is enough to make you like one of the best superhero movies ever made. Dredd 2012. This is one that honestly a lot of people probably have forgotten about, if they even know about it to begin with, because this is another tragic example of the production just ended up getting so long and so overdrawn and so problematic that the studio just didn't bother to market it at all, which is really tragic because in today's day and age, if this movie had come out and like dropped directly to a streaming service, this would have been like one of the most watched things because the people who have seen this movie know how friggin' awesome it is. Judge Dredd is another one of kind of like those random offshoot comics like Hellboy that gained one of those weird followings that somehow a mainstream studio decided to take a chance on it. They tried it once in the 90s with Sylvester Stallone, and that movie just does not work in general. Betray the law! And then you have this movie that comes in and tells honestly something that doesn't even really feel like a superhero story. It's more of just kind of like an exaggerated, hyper stylized cop versus drug dealers, you know, kind of pulpy story that way. A lot of people compare this and said that it was like a video game. And I can safely say that this is probably one of the movies that feels the most accurate towards like when you're watching a gameplay actually take place on screen in front of you. It really is revolutionary in that sense. Carl Urban's performance as Judge Dredd has become well known as one of his many geek icon roles, and the movie is still surprisingly effective. It's surprisingly never gratuitous despite the vast amounts of violence and blood that you see on it. The action is amazingly well shot. The score is unbelievable. I really enjoy how it employs like kind of that gritty post-apocalyptic District 9-esque look that a lot of movies in the late 2000s, early 2010s were employing. This movie's hardcore all where it needs to be. It's got an incredible villain performance from Lena Headey as Mama, the lead drug dealer, and it is just pulse-pounding and enrapturing all the way up until the very end. And the reason why? Because Alex Garland shot it. I don't remember the specific reasoning behind it because they've talked about it a decent amount where Pete Travis, he's the one who's credited with directing this movie, but he said that he had to step away because of some weird contract negotiations that ended up happening and that Garland essentially ended up finishing the movie on his own. So just in my own weird film mind, in my mind, this is his true directorial debut before he did Ex Machina. Okay, so Captain America the Winter Soldier, another superhero sequel and rather underrated superhero sequel, if I'm being honest. People talk all the time about The Dark Knight, say how that's the greatest superhero sequel ever made, one of the best sequels ever made, you know, and just in terms of sequels in general, people talk about, you know, your Godfather 2s, your Terminator 2s, your Empire Strikes Back, but I really do personally believe that Captain America the Winter Soldier deserves to be in that conversation, and not just because of the Marvel of it all. It's kind of the beginning of the 1-2 punch that happened in 2014, which is kind of Marvel proving that they had legs post the first Avengers movie. And I guess the biggest question that I had going forward is after his, I still like the first Captain America, but after his kind of mediocre first movie, how they were going to make Captain America work solo and in the modern day. And I mean, the results speak for themselves. It's still baffling to me how Kevin Feige had the foresight and vision to trust the Russos, whose only real experience at that point had been with comedy and like sitcoms on TV, and trusted them with a Marvel property, and they fucking kicked ass. I've talked at numerous times on this channel about, you know, my love of the Russo brothers and kind of their unconventional path to success, where you went from directing the pilot of Arrested Development to directing Avengers Endgame. Like, that shouldn't happen. Like, that doesn't happen in Hollywood. But just the action set piece that they pulled off, like they set out, like, obviously, you know, I know allusions to previous 70s spy thrillers and everything, but the fact that they set out to make like an action movie and really delivered on the goods, like this movie is a straight up bona fide action movie from start to finish. Not to mention the fact that this is a PG-13 movie that still manages to make all of the action feel pulse pounding, real time. Like every time somebody gets hit in this movie, I can feel like someone's actually getting punched, which is really difficult to pull off in a PG-13 movie. But ultimately, the thing that makes it work is that they made a really good modern-day Captain America movie. They actually focused in on the things that Captain America would have to deal with in the modern day, and I think they did a pretty damn good job with it. It's still one of my favorite Marvel movies. It's still, to me, one of the only Marvel movies that actually tries to have some sort of real-world messaging in it. You know, it seems kind of antithetical now, but still, I mean, I still remember seeing this in 2014 and being like, wow, okay, I'm actually kind of surprised that I'm seeing this in a Marvel movie. And to me, also, it's the movie that really solidified Chris Evans as Captain America. I mean, it was inspired casting to begin with, but like, this is the one that really proved just what he was capable of with both the action and the more dramatic moments, especially with the Winter Soldier reveal. That still hits me every single time. A lot of people would go with Civil War as being the best Captain America movie, but for me, it'll always be the Winter Soldier. This is always going to have a really special spot in my heart. All right, now, easily my most controversial choice for this list, and the only reason why I say that is it is an Avengers movie, but it's probably the Avengers movie that nobody would pick, which is kind of crazy because I still remember being just blown away by this movie when I watched it in theater. I originally had the first Avengers on this list, and now officially I can say that my new favorite of the big Marvel team-up efforts is officially Avengers Infinity War. I can already hear the comments screaming, why not Endgame? Why not Endgame? And I'll tell you why. Endgame, I think, had an easier job, which is kind of really crazy to say in hindsight because Endgame was the movie that technically had to wrap up the whole MCU. But I guess the reason why I say that is because a lot of the legwork had already been done in Infinity War. Like, it would have been one thing if Endgame was this movie that had to play off of, like, if the Thanos retrieving the Infinity Stones and then him, you know, wiping out half the universe happened across a series of movies rather than all in one movie. Like, that would have made, like, I feel like definitely Endgame way more impactful and definitely the movie on this list. Because Marvel had spent their entire time of just kind of setting up all of their heroes across their entire movies before Infinity War, and then they essentially had to take one whole movie, back when it was originally going to be Infinity War Parts 1 and 2, and then when they scrapped that, they essentially had to craft one whole movie where Thanos comes in, gets all the Infinity Stones, and then wins at the end. For them to pull all that off, have every single other Marvel hero that they've established up until this point all share the screen time in this 2.5 hour long movie. I know that we're still used to that, but like at the time, this was really the first time that we were seeing, like, again, like the Avengers were all of them that we'd come to know at this point. We're going to meet up with the Guardians of the Galaxy. Doctor Strange is going to be in it. Spider-Man was in it. Like, and so the thought of that alone was already enticing enough for this movie. But I'll tell you my reason. It's because Thanos might be one of the most compelling characters in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, and not just villains, character. The fact that Marvel had the audacity to, again, in their biggest ensemble movie that they'd put out to date, center the entire movie around the villain. Like, it would have been so easy for them to center this movie around Tony Stark, or Thor, or Gamora, or any of the other characters. It would have been so easy for them to focus on that, but the fact that they actually went out of their way to center this around the villain and make him as compelling as he is. Like, I still remember back in 2018, all of the different people who were coming out and, like, almost agreeing with Thanos because that's how compelling of a character they made him. The fact that you're watching the villain of the movie, the guy that you're supposed to be rooting against, the guy that you're supposed to be rooting for your heroes to beat, the fact that you're spending the majority of this movie with him and you're feeling for him, like, you feel sympathetic, you actually understand his motivations, you're almost kind of like gobsmacked by yourself, by your own reaction of almost being like, yeah, he won at the end because he was the only one that was focused enough, and like he was the only one that actually had like an arc across this 2.5 hour long movie. It still mind boggles me, and the fact that we got that in a Marvel movie too. It's one of those things that I feel like is just one of the more underrated aspects about when people talk about Marvel, and I know it's crazy because everyone and their mother talks about Marvel now, but it's still one of those things that just absolutely blows me away, and that's on top of all the things that I already loved about the Avengers movies, you know, the character meetups, the character interactions, the battle sequences. Those are all still there, and those are all great. And it's kind of crazy too because people talk all the time about how, you know, the ending of Infinity War wasn't really that impactful because we know they're going to come back in the next movie. To some extent, that is true, but I don't know. There was just something about the fact that we spent all that time with Thanos in that movie. The fact that he had more screen time than any other character in that movie, and there was just something about seeing him satisfied at the end that really just made the fact that he essentially wiped half the cast of the entire MCU off the screen, that just made that movie just feel so much more like gut-wrenching and sickening, but also so satisfying in a strange way. The first Guardians of the Galaxy. This is not only one of my favorite superhero movies, this is one of my favorite sci-fi movies, this is one of my favorite adventure movies, and it's honestly just kind of one of my favorite movies in general. James Gunn, God bless him. He really has turned into one of those directors where it just seems like everything that he touches turns to absolute gold. I mean, just look at what he did with the Suicide Squad this past year. It's another Marvel underdog story. The only difference between this and the first Iron Man is that this was after the first Avengers, when Marvel had kind of already established themselves. They hadn't gained complete control over the industry just yet, but they were on their way there. And the first Guardians of the Galaxy was kind of the second part of the whole 2014 batch between that and the Winter Soldier that actually showed that they had legs post the first Avengers. Because I don't know if you guys remember back in 2013 when we had Iron Man 3 and Thor: The Dark World as the first two Marvel movies following up the Avengers. Yikes. And I still remember the criticism. To this day, almost 10 years later, I still remember the criticisms going into this movie because I was one of the people giving them. Why are they doing this team before the second Avengers? Who the hell even are the Guardians of the Galaxy? You're going to do a team that has a raccoon and a talking tree? And, well, I mean, you obviously all know the effects that Rocket and Groot have had on the internet. Baby Groot Funko Pop is like the #1 sold Funko Pop now or something like that. I think the reason why Gunn's just style lends itself so well to really any comic book material that he touches is because he focuses on the elements of comic books, specifically, you know, the characters in comic book lore that really nobody else wants to touch. He likes going after outsiders. He likes going after B and C tier rate characters, which is kind of what Marvel made its bread and butter on. And he applies that in a way that really feels original and heartfelt and unique. And it helps that he's working with characters that at the time really nobody knew about. And so as a result, that kind of allowed James Gunn to come in and really put his own individual stamp and really his own persona and characteristics into each one of these characters. And another thing that Gunn does so well is he is so good at using absolutely ridiculously childish, immature humor to mask up a lot of the characters' really like deep down, you know, kind of broken natures. These are really a bunch of sad, pathetic losers that have really had nobody else to kind of rely on for their entire life. And so aside from all the jokes, all the one-liners, all the crazy explosions, all the nutso space stuff that he kind of included into the MCU, not to mention the fact this being our first actual on-screen, you know, portrayal of Thanos within a movie and not just in a quick cutaway post-credit scene, he really establishes, I think, the formation of a really quintessential and integral team within the MCU, as far as they're not like the Avengers where they kind of come together because they need to. They come together because they just come to depend on each other and love each other. And I feel like that's something we can all relate to. And it's something that kind of, again, differentiated it as part of a whole, you know, just watch the next Marvel movie in order to build up to Thanos. And obviously, it gave us the awesome mixed soundtrack. But yeah, Guardians of the Galaxy, it's still one of the really special ones. The Incredibles, almost 20 years old, and this movie, an animated Pixar movie, is still one of the best superhero movies ever made. It's still kind of baffling to me that in roughly the same time period where we got Bryan Singer's X-Men, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, Ang Lee's very problematic Incredible Hulk movie, we also got a Pixar movie that was far ahead of its time. It was tackling like Civil War and Watchmen before we even got the filmed versions of Civil War and Watchmen. It was an incredibly family drama that was also really intensely real about its portrayal of midlife crisis. Not to mention being still, to this day, the best on-screen version of the Fantastic Four we've ever gotten, because they're pretty much the Fantastic Four in everything except for name. And I mean, what else can I say about this movie that hasn't already been said? I still think that one of the most notable things about it is how they kind of use each member of the team and the member of the family's powers as a reflection of their own personalities and kind of inner flaws. Like, it's that sort of like technical thinking and attention to detail that really, really sets this movie apart from just a lot of other movies in general. And it's that lack of attention to detail that I think really, really drags down the second Incredibles movie. I know a lot of people like the second Incredibles. I am not a fan of that movie at all. I think it just completely misses on everything that made the first one so special and so awesome. And aside from all that, just the way that it captures like kind of like that slick, kind of stylish 60s feel. It's got a lot of James Bond as well, with kind of the over-the-top cadaver villain, you know, the island base, the crazy cockamamie plan involving a giant robot. Like, it is still a superhero movie. But hell, they even give the villain one of the best arcs that I think I've ever seen from a supervillain in general, which again is a trope that we have seen done to death in superhero movies since. And yeah, The Incredibles is still literally incredible. Logan. It's still so weird to talk about this movie because this movie, in a strange way, is kind of like second fiddle to a lot of other movies. It's not the first big mainstream rated R comic book movie success. It was supposed to be a wrap up on the Hugh Jackman arc, but now he's arguably bigger and more popular than he ever was, despite the fact that it's been 5 years removed since it finally gave comic book fans what they'd wanted for years, which is a rated R Logan movie where he's actually slicing and dicing people left and right, only they did the old man Logan story, so it almost felt like it was too little too late by that point. My takeaway from this movie, besides just being absolutely gobsmacked, because it really did take it really was one of the movies that really did take like kind of an entire character legacy and just paid homage to it and wrapped it up in the best way possible. Because I mean, obviously we know the X-Men franchise by that point had just become so haphazard and so discontinuous. Like I don't even know if there was any sort of overstretching continuity. They'd ended the franchise, then they brought it back, then the ones that they used to bring it back weren't that good, then they had to kind of revamp it with Days of Future Past, then they tried to continue with the younger members, but those movies weren't good. It just always sucks because it felt like the Fox X-Men movies were always just grasping onto greatness rather than actually being great. I know a lot of people love the early Bryan Singer X-Men movies, but those movies do not hold up for me personally. They really don't. But obviously everybody knows that Hugh Jackman was always kind of consistently the best part about those movies. And so the fact that James Mangold was just able to do what it is that he wanted and give the character of Wolverine the send-off that it is that he deserved, this movie just fires on all cylinders. It's an incredible deconstructionist superhero piece more than anything else. It really is cool and interesting, and it really is something that I'd never seen from a superhero movie before. How this movie essentially acts as one 2-hour long kind of goodbye with this character. It was something that I wasn't at all expecting, and it's something that's still really refreshing even 5 years later. And number one, no question, unequivocally, I talked about this movie to death. Everyone's talked about this movie to death at this point. The Dark Knight. I still cannot believe that it's been 14 years since this movie came out. That's nuts to me. Because surprisingly enough, I was one of the few people that didn't watch The Dark Knight when it came out in theaters. It's still kind of surprising to me in hindsight that just because of how much of an impact the movie had upon its initial release, and still to this day, like 14 years later, it's still hailed as like kind of the quintessential go-to for all superhero cinema. And any first-time person coming into the game wants to understand movies. I mean, they watch this movie, they understand it completely. Almost everything about this movie still works, still holds up. Nolan's direction, the fact that he was the first to really use IMAX filmmaking towards superhero films, the fact that this movie largely is an homage to Heat, while also just an incredible action thriller. Some of the greatest action set pieces ever put to screen. It more fully realizes and captures and hones in on what made Christian Bale's portrayal of the character so great to begin with. Really hunkers down, fleshes out a lot of the other supporting characters we'd come to know and love. We get a new casting, obviously with Maggie Gyllenhaal replacing Katie Holmes. And of course, the coup de grace, I'm saving him because, I mean, we all know it. It's Ledger. Ledger is what makes this movie. Jack Nicholson's Joker, it's fine in hindsight, but like there's a reason why literally every single person that's taken on the mantle of this character since has kind of had the shadow, the specter, let's call it, of Ledger looming over them because of just how fucking good he is in this movie. And yeah, I'm gonna say it right now. And it's crazy because anybody who watches this, anybody who knows me knows how big of a Godfather fan I am. Ledger, greatest performance of all time. Hands down, no question. So yeah, greatest performance, greatest comic book movie, one of my favorite movies ever made. It's the movie that really set the bar and the template as far as for what superhero movies were able to accomplish. It was kind of like tied off like that era of superhero filmmaking that showed, okay, we've been trying this entire time to show what superhero movies are capable of, what superhero storytelling can actually do, and The Dark Knight came in and kind of polished it. In fact, it set the bar so high that I feel like almost every single movie that's come out since is not held up to it. Like, there's a reason why we haven't had a superhero movie as good as The Dark Knight since. Had a few that have come close, but like, again, even its own sequel couldn't do what The Dark Knight did. So yeah, Dark Knight, number one. Greatest superhero movie of all time. I don't think that can really be disputed.